Hello, this is episode 35 of the True Crime Nightmare podcast. This episode concentrates on the crimes of a lesser-known serial killer from the UK. The main reason he is not very well known appears to be largely due to the fact that he operated at around about the same time as the so-called Yorkshire Ripper Peter Sutcliffe did. Peter Sutcliffe was around for a lot longer, but this serial killer started off around about the same time in the north of England as well, so didn't get as much media coverage as the so-called Yorkshire Ripper did. This is the case of serial killer Trevor Hardy, who killed 3 women and was suspected by some, anyway, to have killed a 4th victim. Trevor Hardy was born on the 11th of June of 1945. He was born in a place called Newton Heath, which is in Manchester. Manchester is in the northwest of England. Trevor had a younger brother called Colin, who he tried to blame for one of the murders. People who knew the family were aware that Trevor Hardy was bad news pretty early on. He would often target people and regularly would beat up local boys. Trevor Hardy was even known to attack and beat up his own brother Colin. Colin later admitted that he was scared of his older brother. A lot of the local children were rightfully also scared of Trevor Hardy. It appeared to some people that he enjoyed holding fear over others, and this was from an early age too. He was known to have a very short fuse and would often just fly into rages for no apparent reason. Trevor Hardy had also beaten someone so badly that the other boy was left unconscious. Not surprisingly, many of the locals at the time would try and avoid any contact with Trevor Hardy. When professionals looked into Trevor Hardy's life and his violent tendencies many years later, they came to the conclusion that for some reason he had been resentful of the arrival of his younger brother Colin. It came to light that he resented any attention being directed onto Colin, and although this in itself is not that unusual, most siblings grow out of it, but for some reason Trevor never did. As for most of his childhood and early adult life, Trevor Hardy was someone who people would always try to avoid having any sort of contact with. He could not really hold down a job either, it would seem, and would flit between low-paid jobs. Trevor Hardy, having always been violent towards other people, now decided in early adulthood to target women. His first known murder victim was a girl called Janet Leslie Stewart, who was only 15 years old at the time. She would be Trevor Hardy's youngest murder victim. His murder spree spanned from December of 1974 until he was caught in March of 1976. All of the murders that he would be convicted of took place in Manchester. Janet Leslie Stewart was walking home after attending a New Year's Eve party in 1974 when she came across Trevor Hardy. Trevor Hardy violently stabbed her to death in a frenzied attack. He then buried her body in a shallow grave in Newton Heath in Manchester. Janet Leslie Stewart's body would not be found until Trevor Hardy confessed to her murder a few years later. She was classed as a missing person until he confessed and led the police to her remains. Trevor Hardy's second known murder victim was a young girl called Wanda Skyler, who was 17 years old at the time of her brutal death. Wanda Skyler had been walking home along Lightbourne Road in Moston, which is a district of Manchester, when Trevor Hardy attacked and murdered her. Wanda had just finished her shift as a barmaid at a local hotel and was on her way home. Trevor Hardy followed her and then he hit her over the head with a brick. He then robbed her and also sexually assaulted her. The autopsy showed that Wanda had died from the blow to her head from the brick. This murder had taken place on the 19th of July of 1975. Trevor Hardy had moved her body to a local building site where he then partially buried her. Wanda Skyler's body was found a short while later when the workmen started back at the site the next day. Trevor Hardy's last known murder victim was a girl called Sharon Mossoff, who, just like Wanda Skyler, had only been 17 years old when she was killed by Trevor Hardy. Sharon Mossoff was killed in March of 1976. She was stabbed and strangled. Trevor Hardy had used a pair of tights to strangle Sharon Mossoff to death. Sharon Mossoff, just like the previous victims, had been walking home when she was set upon by this evil serial killer. She had just left a friend's party and was on her way back to the family home. So all three girls just had been going about their everyday lives when this evil man killed them. Trevor Hardy was initially arrested in connection with his second victim's death, Wanda Skyler. His first victim, Janet Leslie Stewart, had not been found at this stage, but Trevor Hardy had apparently bragged about killing Wanda to his younger brother, Colin. Colin had gone to the police to tell them about what his brother had told him, but Trevor's partner at the time, a woman called Sheila Farrow, gave him an alibi. So despite being arrested and questioned about the murder by the police and Colin telling the police that Trevor had bragged about the murder, because of the alibi that his partner supplied, Trevor Hardy was free to likely kill again, and he literally did kill again. He killed his third victim, Sharon Mossoff, only 6 months later. However, the police arrested him again in August of 1976 in connection with Wanda and Sharon's murders. This time, Trevor Hardy confessed to both murders, and he also confessed to the murder of Janet Leslie Stewart, who was still only listed as a missing person at this stage. Her body would be recovered once Trevor Hardy gave the police all of the gory details. When the police started investigating Trevor Hardy, it turned out that he already had a criminal record. Just before Janet Leslie Stewart's murder in 1974, Trevor Hardy had been released on parole for battering a man with a pickaxe. The police retrieved a lot of evidence against Trevor Hardy. A ring that he had taken from Janet Leslie Stewart's finger had been given to a girl that he was keen on as a so-called love token. Trevor Hardy had also kept some of Wanda Skyler's clothes, which were heavily bloodstained. He had also kept her handbag, possibly as some sort of trophy. More evidence would come out at court, along with more details about the murders themselves, details that were largely supplied to the police by the killer himself. Not all murderers confess to their crimes, although some do for whatever reason, and Trevor Hardy appeared to be the killer that would actually confess once he was cornered. According to Trevor Hardy, none of the three victims were actually targeted as such by him. He said that he just came across them by chance. One of the murders, Wanda Skyler's, apparently started off as a so-called bag snatch but quickly escalated into full-blown murder. He was clearly out of control and probably had been for most of his life, when you factor in all of the people he had already harmed along the way. It does not seem all that surprising to me that after being so violent for many years that he escalated to murder in the end. Trevor Hardy finally went on trial for his crimes in May of 1978 at the Manchester Crown Court in Manchester. He pleaded guilty to the three murders and was sentenced to 3 life sentences with a minimum of 30 years to be served. His life sentence was eventually upgraded to a whole life tariff. Only one of very few prisoners in England or any part of the UK actually that have actually been handed that particular sentence down. He was certainly in horrible company with others that had received or had had their sentences upgraded. Peter Sutcliffe, the so-called Yorkshire Ripper, was one. He died in 2020 in prison. He had been found guilty of 13 murders. Dennis Nielsen, who died in prison, had a whole life tariff as well. Rose West is serving a whole life tariff after being found guilty of many murders. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, the so-called Moors murderers, also had been handed whole life tariffs, and that was given to them partway through their sentences, many years later, actually, because they were convicted in the 1960s. They both died in prison anyway. Fortunately, Trevor Hardy would not ever be released from prison, and he died while still serving his life sentence. As well as the 3 women or girls that he was convicted of killing, he was also suspected of killing another girl. Dorothy Leyden, who had been 17 years old at the time of her murder, had lived in Manchester. Dorothy's body had been found dumped behind a local pub, which at the time was called the Spread Eagle pub. The pub was located on Rochdale Road in a town called Collyhurst, which is in Manchester. However, after the case was revised in recent years by a cold case team, it was established that the DNA that was discovered at the scene where Dorothy's body was found did not match Trevor Hardy's DNA, so he was exonerated from having anything to do with her murder. So there was not enough evidence to charge him in connection with this unsolved murder. Dorothy Leyden's murder, which had taken place in 1971, is still unsolved, and although it would appear that some people believe that Trevor Hardy was in some way responsible for her death, a DNA sample did not show him to have any connection with her death at all. There has recently been a documentary made regarding this case, the case of Trevor Hardy and the 3 murders, and also the unsolved murder. The documentary covers all 3 of the murders that were known to have been committed by Trevor Hardy. The programme goes back to his childhood, as so many good documentaries do, and also interviewed some people who were relevant to the case at the time. Trevor Hardy's brother was also featured, and it was obvious that his brother's crimes had taken quite a toll on him. He had empathy for the victims' families as well as for the victims themselves. He did not try to make excuses, not that any excuse could justify what his evil brother did, but at least he did not try to make some sense of any of it. He obviously wanted to totally clear his name as well, although it is not really believed, as far as I could make out, that anyone had actually believed Colin Hardy had had any hand in any of the murders. Trevor Hardy continued to try and implicate his brother in one of the murders, even after he had been sentenced for the 3 murders that he had confessed to. So, he was hell-bent on getting his brother in trouble with the police, and with the police looking at him, and maybe for people to think that Colin was guilty of committing crimes or having some part of the murders. But there was no evidence, and I don't think the police believed any of it, really. It was just nonsense, really. Trevor Hardy was obviously a coward as well as an evil murderer, and did not want to take the full responsibility of what he had done to any of the girls. He was probably still jealous of his younger brother and resentful, but at the end of the day, Trevor Hardy was the one that had committed the murders. Trevor Hardy was dubbed the Beast of Manchester mainly by the tabloid newspapers at the time. He managed to escape capture for almost 2 years before finally the police caught up with him. The unsolved murder of Dorothy Leyden has always been associated with him. However, with many advances in DNA, the samples taken from the scene at the time of her murder have since been looked at and tested, and the DNA does not match him at all. Colin Hardy had, by all accounts, tried to help the police in regards to solving Dorothy's murder, but sadly it is still unsolved. It has been 40 years since the 17-year-old was brutally murdered in Manchester and her body was just dumped. As all of Trevor Hardy's crimes came to light, it would turn out that he had already served time in prison for a violent attack on a man. He had attacked the man with a pickaxe. In 1972, when Trevor Hardy was 31 years old, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for this particular violent attack on this stranger. He was released from Albany Prison, which is situated on the Isle of Wight, on the 18th of November of 1974, so he only served about half of the sentence in the end. Within weeks of his early release, he committed his first murder. Apparently, he had told fellow prisoners that he was going to get revenge on 2 people who he had felt had wronged him in some way. The first person he said he wanted to take revenge on was an ex-friend called Stanley O'Brien. His reasons for wanting revenge were apparently also to do with feeling that he had in some way been double-crossed by Stanley. The second person he wanted to get revenge on was a 14-year-old girl called Beverly Driver. Beverly had supposedly been a girlfriend of Trevor's, despite the fact that he was twice her age and she was under the age of 16, which is the legal age of consent in the UK and was back in the 1970s as well. He was mad with her because since he had been locked up, she had found a boy of her own age to date instead. So he wanted to catch up with her to exact some sort of revenge on her. However, in regards to his ex-friend Stanley, Trevor soon discovered that Stanley had died recently. Trevor Hardy, soon after being released from prison, went to his ex-girlfriend's house and threw an axe up at her bedroom window for some reason, and it actually broke the glass. He did not see Beverly at the time, but was obviously angry and intent on harm. On his way back from Beverly's house, he came across 15-year-old Janet Leslie Stewart, who was walking along, heading to meet up with her boyfriend. He appeared to have had so much pent-up anger which he had festered on whilst in prison and snapped. He stabbed Janet Leslie many times and then he threw her onto a nearby clay pit. He told police a few years later that when he was questioned about other murders that he went back to check on the body and tried to hide evidence on multiple occasions. He also said that he cut up the body and buried some of the body parts in other places. He threw her head into a nearby lake. It would take almost 2 years before Janet Leslie Stewart's missing persons case would become a murder case. Trevor Hardy had removed a ring from one of Janet Leslie's fingers and then proceeded to give the ring to a new love interest of his a little while later. His next victim was Wanda Skyler, and he killed her in July of 1975. Wanda had worked as a part-time barmaid at a local pub. She was murdered only 400 yards from her home. This time Trevor used a brick to kill her. He battered Wanda multiple times with it before strangling her with her own tights. Buried Wanda Skyler in a makeshift shallow grave at a local builder's yard, but fortunately her body was soon discovered. Trevor Hardy had left a bite mark on Wanda Skyler's body, which would become important during the court case. He took so-called trophies from the victim, the blood-stained clothes and handbag. Trevor Hardy's next victim was Sharon Mossoff, who had been walking to her family home after having been to a party. Trevor Hardy stripped her, strangled her, and threw her body into a nearby canal. Sharon Mossoff had also been murdered close to her family home, just 300 yards away, in fact. It transpired that Trevor Hardy had taken a nipple of one of his last two victims. What happened to it, nobody knows, and Trevor Hardy didn't say when he was questioned about it later. He had apparently panicked about evidence from his teeth marks and began to file down his teeth with a metal file. This all came out in the court case. The net closed in on Trevor Hardy due to not only information from Trevor's brother Colin, but also from another girl who had been recently attacked by Trevor Hardy, but had somehow managed to get away from him, luckily. Once cornered, he wrote a 40-page confession to the police that would be used in court later on. At least he confessed to the murder of his first and youngest victim, Janet Leslie Stewart, because she was still classed as a missing person because her body had not been discovered. He did not admit to trying to frame his brother Colin Hardy, though. He kept that lie going until Trevor Hardy's death. The resentment towards Colin was clearly extremely deep, that once caught and put away, he could not bring himself to admit that he had made up the allegations against his brother. It clearly had an impact on Colin Hardy's life as well. The victims' families all attended the court case, as you would expect. Margaret Stewart, the mother of Janet Leslie Stewart, attended. The mother and father of Wanda Skyler were also there, as was Sharon Mossoff's father, Ralph, and her stepmother, Jackie. It must have been a nightmare for all family and friends of all three poor girls. All three girls had their whole lives ahead of them, and all three were just out doing what all young people enjoy doing. They were socialising with friends or returning home from work when they had the misfortune to run into Trevor Hardy, who, although had always been violent and was known by those in the community to be violent, he had never killed before, at least to anyone's knowledge and to the police's knowledge. He had not killed prior to his first victim, Janet Leslie Stewart. Luckily, the evil killer died in prison in 2012. Trevor Hardy had got rid of his defence team at some point and chose to defend himself, which meant that all of the documentation and other paperwork relating to the murder case would be his to keep, and he was able to pass it on when he died, and for some reason he decided to pass it on to his brother Colin Hardy. This is how his younger brother Colin came to gain all of the many boxes and files due to them being left to him by his brother. Colin Hardy went through all of the paperwork and also let the documentary team have access to it as well to help with their content. In amongst the paperwork was some information that confirmed that Trevor Hardy had been trying to implicate Colin to one of the murders. Colin Hardy was never a suspect, and the police knew that it was just the ramblings of a despicable killer. And although Colin Hardy had hoped that by being involved in the documentary and handing paperwork over to the team that were doing the documentary, that some information would come to light that would lead to the solving of Deborah's murder, but unfortunately there was no evidence that could be gained from any of the paperwork, and the DNA tests that were carried out later, didn't point to it being Trevor Hardy that was responsible for Dorothy's murder. And like I said before, the murder is still unsolved. Hopefully one day new evidence will come to light that will solve Deborah's murder and the person be identified and hopefully put away for the rest of his life. In my opinion, the documentary, which is called Britain's Forgotten Serial Killer, Trevor Hardy, goes into a lot of details about the cases and looks at the unsolved murder case as well in some detail. It's a very good documentary in my opinion. This was and still is a sad case, and the poor victims never stood a chance against such an evil serial killer. They did not know that when they set off just doing whatever they were doing at that time, that they would come across someone who clearly did not care at all about human life, apart from maybe his own life. The families have clearly suffered and will continue to suffer because of the loss of their daughters. The local area would have been in turmoil as well, and would in all likelihood have take decades to recover. There will be some people who will never recover from what Trevor Hardy did all those years ago in their local area. Thank you very much for listening. The credits for this episode go to the documentary Britain's Forgotten Serial Killer Trevor Hardy, and that's by the Crime and Investigation Network, the Mirror Group newspapers, and Wikipedia. Thank you very much.